Chapter 1. Mrs. Rachel Lynde and Matthew Cuthbert are surprised. Mrs. Rachel Lynde lived in a small village in the country. She liked to sit at her window and watch everybody pass by. She knew almost as much about their lives as they did. One afternoon in early June, she went to see her neighbor, Marilla Cuthbert, who lived at Green Gables. "Good evening, Rachel," Marilla said. "How is your family?" "We're all well," said Mrs. Lynde. "And how is your brother Matthew?" "Oh, he's quite well," she said. "He's gone to Bright River. We're getting a little boy from a children's home in Hopeton, and he's coming on the train tonight." Mrs. Lynde was so surprised that she could not speak for a minute. "We've been thinking about it for some time," said Marilla. "We thought we'd get a boy. Matthew isn't young, and he needs help on the farm. We'll give him a good home and send him to school." "Well, Marilla," Mrs. Lynde said, "I think you're doing a very foolish thing. You're bringing a strange child into your home." "Matthew wants to do it," Marilla said. "Well, I hope it will turn out all right," said Mrs. Lynde. When Mrs. Lynde was walking home, she thought, "I feel sorry for the child. Matthew and Marilla don't know anything about children. I pity him, I really do." When Matthew Cuthbert reached the station, there was no sign of any train. The only person he could see was a young girl, who seemed to be waiting for someone. He went to speak to the station master. "The 5:30 train has been in and left half an hour ago," the man said. "But there was a passenger left for you, a little girl. She's sitting out there." "I'm not expecting a girl," said Matthew. "I'm expecting a boy." "There must be a mistake," the station master said. "Mrs. Spencer said that you and your sister were adopting that girl from a children's home." Matthew decided to go and speak to the girl. When he walked up to her, she said, "Are you Mr. Matthew Cuthbert of Green Gables? I'm very glad to see you. I was beginning to think you weren't coming for me." Matthew didn't want to say he had been expecting a boy, so he said, "I'm sorry I was late. Come with me. The horse is outside. Give me your bag." "Oh, I can carry it," the child said. "It's got everything I own in it, but it isn't heavy." On the journey home, the girl talked all the time. Matthew, much to his own surprise, was enjoying himself. He did not usually like to be with women, but this child pleased him. "I hope I'm not talking too much," she said. "Oh, you can talk as much as you like," he told her. "Oh, I'm so glad. I know you and I are going to be friends. It feels good to talk when I want to. Too many times I've heard that children should be seen and not heard." They soon passed a house. "Mr. Barry lives there," Matthew said. "He's got a little girl called Diana. She's about 11. A few minutes later, he said, "We're almost home now. That's Green Gables over there." "Oh, I love it," she said. "It's just how I thought it would be." Chapter 2. Marilla Cuthbert is surprised. When Marilla saw Matthew at the door with the little girl, she said, "Matthew Cuthbert, who's that? Where is the boy?" "There wasn't any boy," said Matthew. "There was only her." "No boy? But there must have been a boy," said Marilla. "We told Mrs. Spencer to bring a boy." The little girl heard this and cried out, "You don't want me. You don't want me because I'm not a boy. Nobody wants me. Oh, what shall I do?" And she began to cry. Well, there's no need to cry so about it," Marilla said. "What's your name?" The child thought for a moment. "Will you please call me Cordelia?" she asked. "Call you Cordelia? Is that your name? No, but I would love to be called Cordelia. If Cordelia isn't your name, what is? Anne Shirley, said the child. Anne is a good name. I like Cordelia better. But if you call me Anne, please call me Anne spelled with an E. What difference does it make how it's spelled? Asked Marilla. Oh, it makes such a difference. It looks so much nicer. Very well then, Anne spelled with an E. You may stay tonight. Tomorrow we will go and see Mrs. Spencer and find out how this mistake happened. Marilla took Anne to a small bedroom. The girl quickly undressed, put on the nightdress she had brought with her, and got into bed. Marilla said to Matthew later, "This girl will have to be sent back to the children's home." "Yes, I suppose so," said Matthew sadly. "But she is a really nice little child, Marilla. It's a pity to send her back when she wants to stay here." When Anne woke up the next morning, she could not remember where she was. Then she remembered. This was Green Gables, and they didn't want her because she wasn't a boy. She looked out of the window. It was such a beautiful place. She wished they would not send her away. Then Marilla came into the room. "You'd better get dressed and come downstairs," she said. "Breakfast is waiting. Wash your face and comb your hair." During the drive back to the station, Marilla said, "It's 5 miles, and since you enjoy talking so much, you can tell me what you know about yourself." "I was 11 last March," said Anne, "and I was born in Bolingbroke, Nova Scotia. My father and mother were teachers. They were very poor and lived in a small yellow house in Bolingbroke. My mother died from a fever soon after I was born, and my father died 4 days later from fever too. I lived with some people called Thomas until I was 8 years old and helped look after their other children. Then Mr. Thomas was killed when he fell under a train. His mother offered to take Mrs. Thomas and the children, but she didn't want me. Then Mrs. Hammond from up the river came down and said she'd take me, and I went up the river to live with her for 2 years and look after all her children. Then she died. Nobody wanted me, so I was put in a children's home." "Were those women, Mrs. Thomas and Mrs. Hammond, good to you?" asked Marilla, looking at Anne. "Oh, they meant to be. They had a lot to worry them, you know." Marilla asked no more questions. She felt sorry for Anne. The child had had a hard life, living with people who did not really want her. She began to think it was a pity the girl had to be sent back to the children's home. Chapter 3. Mrs. Rachel Lynde is not pleased. Marilla thought long and hard about keeping Anne. She knew that her brother wanted to keep her, and she saw that the girl was clever, even if she liked to dream. The next afternoon, Marilla said to the little girl, "Sit down and listen. We have decided that you may stay here. You must go to school when it opens again in September." "Oh, thank you," Anne said happily. "What am I to call you? Can I call you Aunt Marilla?" "No, you'll call me just plain Marilla." "I'd love to call you Aunt Marilla," said Anne. "I've never had an aunt or even a grandmother. Can't I call you Aunt Marilla?" No. Anne had been at Green Gables a fortnight before Mrs. Rachel Lynde came to see what she was like. "You're not much to look at," Mrs. Lynde said. "You're very thin and plain, and your face has freckles, and your hair is the color of carrots." "I hate you!" cried Anne. "I hate you! I hate you!" "What a temper!" cried Mrs. Lynde. "Anne, go to your room and stay there until I come up," said Marilla. Anne ran to her room crying. Afterward, Marilla went upstairs to talk to Anne. "Mrs. Lynde had no right to call me ugly and red-headed," Anne cried. "You had no right to get angry like that," said Marilla in a calm voice. "You must go to Mrs. Lynde and tell her you are sorry." "No," Anne said. "I'm not sorry." The next morning, Matthew went to Anne's room. "I think you should apologize to Mrs. Lynde," he said. "Will you do that for me?" Anne thought about this. She liked Matthew. She thought he was kind. "All right," she said. "I'll apologize." "Good girl," Matthew said. Anne went downstairs and said to Marilla, "I'm sorry I was rude to Mrs. Lynde. I'd like to apologize to her." Marilla was surprised, but also very pleased. They drove over to Mrs. Rachel Lynde's house. Anne fell to her knees in front of Mrs. Lynde. "Please, Mrs. Lynde, forgive me for being so rude to you yesterday. I am so very sorry. Can you find it in your heart ever to forgive me?" Marilla thought Anne's apology was rather strange. "Get up, child," said Mrs. Lynde. "Of course I forgive you. I was a little too hard on you. Now, go into the garden and pick a few flowers for yourself." "She's a strange child," Mrs. Lynde said to Marilla. "But she may turn out all right. I quite like her." On their way home, Anne said to Marilla, "I apologized well, didn't I?" Anne said no more until they turned into their own road. Then she said, "It's lovely to be going home and know it's home. I love Green Gables already, and I never loved any place before. Oh, Marilla, I'm so happy." When they arrived home, there was a letter from Mrs. Barry inviting Marilla to bring Anne to meet her daughter Diana. They went over that afternoon. Diana was a very pretty, happy little girl, with her mother's black eyes and hair and red cheeks. "Diana," said Mrs. Barry, "take Anne out into the garden and show her your flowers." The berry garden was full of flowers. Anne loved it. She said to Diana, "Oh, Diana, do you think you can like me enough to be my friend?" Diana laughed. She always laughed before she spoke. "Why, I think so," she said. "It will be good to have somebody to play with." The two little girls walked about the garden, and Anne felt happier than she had been for a very long time. Chapter 4. A Storm in the School Teapot. "What a lovely day," said Anne, as she and Diana walked to school. The two girls always walked to school together. They walked through the trees and over the old bridge, talking all the time. The Avonlea School was a white building with old-fashioned desks. Behind it was a small stream where the children put their bottles of milk to keep it cool. Anne liked school very much, even though she was behind the other students in the lessons. She had a better imagination than any of them. She also liked having other little girls to play with. In their class was a boy called Gilbert Blythe. He was tall with brown hair, bright eyes, and a big smile. He was always playing tricks on the girls and making them laugh. One day, Anne was looking out of the window at the fields and trees. Suddenly, she felt a tug at her hair and heard Gilbert say, "Carrots, carrots!" Anne was so angry. She jumped to her feet and thwack! She hit Gilbert on the head with her writing slate. Everybody cried, "Oh!" Mr. Phillips, the teacher, said, "Anne, go and stand in front of the blackboard for the rest of the afternoon." Anne stood in front of the blackboard all afternoon, feeling very angry. The next day, she was in trouble with Mr. Phillips again for being late. "Anne," said Mr. Phillips, "go and sit next Gilbert Blythe." This was the worst thing imaginable. Anne did not look at Gilbert at all, but he tried to talk to her and gave her some candy. She dropped it on the floor and crushed it with her shoe. Anne's mind was made up. She would not go to school to Mr. Phillips's class again. She told Marilla so when she got home. "Nonsense," said Marilla. "You'll go to school tomorrow as usual." But Anne was stubborn. Marilla did not know what to do, so she went to see Mrs. Lynde. "Well, Marilla," said Mrs. Lynde, happy that Marilla had come to see her, "I think you should let her stay home for a while. She'll soon decide to go back to school." Marilla took Mrs. Lynde's advice and let Anne stay home. Anne learned her lessons at home, helped around the house, and played with Diana. When she saw Gilbert Blythe, she passed him by with an icy look. Anne had decided to hate Gilbert Blythe to the end of her life. Chapter 5. Diana is invited to tea with terrible results. One afternoon, Marilla told Anne she could invite Diana over for tea. She could have some fruit cake, some jam, and some of the raspberry cordial in the cupboard. Anne ran down the road to Diana's house to ask her to tea. Diana came in her second-best dress. She poured herself a glass of cordial and drank it. "That's very nice raspberry cordial, Anne," she said. "I'm happy you like it. Take as much as you want." And so Diana had 2 more glasses of cordial. Suddenly, she turned pale. "I'm sick," she said. "I must go home." And she left Green Gables and ran all the way home. On Monday, Anne went to see if Diana was feeling better. She soon ran back home with tears rolling down her cheeks. "Whatever has happened, Anne?" asked Marilla. "Mrs. Barry says that I sent Diana home drunk on Saturday. She says she's never, ever going to let Diana play with me again." Marilla went to the cupboard and then came back to the kitchen with a bottle of wine, trying not to smile. "Anne, you gave Diana wine instead of raspberry cordial. Didn't you know the difference?" "I never tasted it," said Anne. "But Mrs. Barry will never believe me, and now I'll never be able to play with Diana again." The following Monday, Anne surprised Marilla by coming down from her room with her books. "I'm going back to school," she said. "That is all there is left in life for me, now that my friend is gone." Marilla tried not to show how happy she was to hear this. "You'd better work hard," she said. Anne did work hard, and soon she was top of the class with Gilbert Blythe, whom she still found very annoying. One evening, Anne was at home doing her homework. Matthew was home, but Marilla had gone to town with the Barrys and Mrs. Lynde. Suddenly, Anne looked up and saw Diana standing at the door. She looked very worried. "What is the matter, Diana?" cried Anne. "Oh, Anne, do come quick," said Diana nervously. "Minnie May is very sick. Father and Mother are away in town, and there's nobody to go for the doctor." Matthew quietly got his cap and coat and went for the doctor. The 2 little girls ran to Diana's house hand in hand. Minnie May was Diana's 3-year-old sister. She was very sick. Anne saw her and immediately went to work. She had looked after many children before and knew what to do. "First, we must have lots of hot water. Put the fire on. I'm going to give her some medicine." Minnie May did not like the medicine, but Anne did not give up. All night Diana and Anne stayed with Minnie May. It was 3 o'clock when Matthew came with the doctor, but by then Minnie May was sleeping. Anne explained to the doctor what she had done. He was very impressed. Later on, he told Mr. and Mrs. Barry, "That little red-headed girl is very smart. She saved that baby's life." The next day at dinner, Marilla had something important to tell Anne. "Mrs. Barry was here this afternoon, Anne. She says you saved Minnie May's life, and she is very sorry she acted as she did about the wine. She says she is happy for you to play with Diana again." That night, Anne was invited to the Barrys for a lovely dinner. They all said wonderful things about her, and she felt very special. Chapter 6. A Wonderful Evening and a Big Surprise. One evening, Mrs. Barry said she would take Diana and Anne to their school's concert at the hall to celebrate Diana's birthday. She also said that Anne could stay over. Anne and Diana dressed in their very best clothes. Anne's clothes were not as pretty as Diana's, but she imagined that they were. They rode through the snow to the concert. The evening was very entertaining. There was only one performance that Anne did not enjoy, which was Gilbert Blythe's poetry reading. Anne picked up a library book and read it until he had finished. It was 11 when they got home. The house was dark and silent. The girls undressed in front of the fire and then ran to the spare room. They raced to see who could reach the bed first. They jumped onto the bed at the same moment. Then, something moved. "Oh, goodness!" said a voice. Anne and Diana jumped off the bed and ran away, very surprised. "Who was it?" whispered Anne. "It was Aunt Josephine," laughed Diana. "Oh, she will be so angry." "How funny, Anne." The next morning, Anne left Diana's house very early. She saw her again in the afternoon. "Your Aunt Josephine was very angry, wasn't she?" said Anne. "Yes," answered Diana. "She said I was the worst behaved girl she ever saw. She says she won't stay at the house another night." "Well," said Anne, "I want to tell her that it was my fault." "No, Anne," said Diana. "She'll eat you alive." But Anne didn't listen. She walked into the house and knocked on the door of the sitting room. "Come in," said a voice. Miss Josephine Barry was knitting by the fire. "Who are you?" Miss Barry cried. "I'm Anne of Green Gables," said the small visitor, "and I've come to tell the truth." "The truth about what?" "That it was all my fault jumping into bed on you last night. We were only having fun. If you are going to be angry with me and not Diana. I'm used to it. I am sure you were frightened, but then so were we. Can you imagine? We couldn't sleep in the spare room as we were promised." Miss Barry actually laughed. "I'm afraid it has been a long time since I used my imagination. Sit down here and tell me about yourself." "I am very sorry. I can't," said Anne firmly. "I would like to, because you seem like an interesting lady. But I must go home to Miss Marilla Cuthbert. I hope you will stay longer in Avonlea." "I think perhaps I will, if you will come over and talk to me sometimes," said Miss Barry. That evening, Miss Barry decided to stay, just so that she could meet again with Anne. "She amuses me, and at my time of life, an amusing person is hard to find," she told Mr. and Mrs. Barry. Miss Barry stayed for more than a month. She and Anne soon became good friends. When Miss Barry went away, she asked Anne to visit her. "Remember," Miss Barry told Anne, "when you come to town and visit, you can stay in my very best spare room." Chapter 7. An Interesting Cake. Anne had now been at Green Gables for a year. It was summer and an exciting time in the village. Mr. Phillips, the school teacher, was leaving, and there was a new minister for the church. Even more exciting was that he had a lovely young wife who would be the new teacher. The new minister and his wife were a young, good-looking couple, still on their honeymoon. Everyone liked them and invited them to tea. Anne liked Mrs. Allen immediately. "She's taken our class until the new teacher, Miss Stacy, arrives. She says we can ask her any question we like, and I asked her lots. I'm good at asking questions, Marilla." "I believe you," said Marilla. "We must have Mr. and Mrs. Allen up to tea sometime soon," she added. "Oh, yes," said Anne. "And may I make a cake?" "Yes, you may," promised Marilla. Marilla and Anne prepared for tea all Monday and Tuesday. They made a great deal of food. Marilla wanted to give Mr. and Mrs. Allen the best tea of any family in the village. Wednesday morning came. Anne got up very early because she was too excited to sleep. After breakfast, she made her cake. The cake came out of the oven looking perfect. "Can I put flowers from the garden on the table?" asked Anne. "Mrs. Barry had flowers on her table," she added cleverly, "and the minister told her it looked lovely." "Well, do as you like," said Marilla. The minister and his wife arrived, and they all enjoyed a lovely tea. Everything went well, until Anne's cake was passed around. "Oh, you must take a piece of this, Mrs. Allen," said Marilla. "Anne made it just for you." "In that case, I must try it," laughed Mrs. Allen. She took a mouthful, and a strange look came onto her face. Marilla tried hers and said, "Anne, what on earth is in this cake?" "Oh, isn't it all right?" cried Anne. "It's terrible. What flavoring did you use?" "Vanilla," said Anne. "Go and bring me the bottle of vanilla you used." Anne returned with a small bottle labeled vanilla. Marilla took it and smelled it. "Anne, you flavored that cake with medicine. I broke a bottle of medicine last week and poured the rest of it in this old vanilla bottle. Couldn't you smell it?" Anne burst into tears and ran to her room. Lying on her bed, she heard somebody come in. "Oh, Marilla," cried Anne without looking up. "It's terrible. Mrs. Allen will think I tried to poison her." "My dear little girl, don't cry," said a happy voice. Anne jumped up to find Mrs. Allen standing by her bed. "It's just a funny mistake that anybody might make." "But I wanted to make a nice cake for you." "Thank you, dear. But now, will you show me your flower garden? I love flowers." Anne showed Mrs. Allen her flower garden and soon felt much better. No more was said about the cake. When Mr. and Mrs. Allen left, Anne turned to Marilla. "Marilla, isn't it nice to think that tomorrow is a new day with no mistakes in it yet?" Chapter 8. Matthew Wants Puff Sleeves. It soon became winter, and one evening Matthew came into the kitchen after a long day to find Anne and her school friends practicing for the school Christmas concert. The children loved having Miss Stacy as their teacher. She gave them such interesting things to do. Matthew, taking off his boots, watched the girls play. He noticed something about Anne that was different from her friends. But what was it? Of course! Anne was not dressed like the other girls. Marilla dressed her in plain dark dresses that were all the same. Anne's sleeves did not look at all like the sleeves of the other girls who wore theirs puffed. Of course, Marilla knew best, but surely the girl could have one pretty dress. Matthew decided that he would give her a nice new one for Christmas. The next evening, Matthew went to town to buy the dress. He did not know much about dresses. When the girl asked him what he wanted, he did not know what to say. In the end, he came home with brown sugar, but no dress. "I never use brown sugar," said Marilla. "Well, you might sometime," said Matthew, making his escape. The next day, Matthew asked Mrs. Lynde to pick out a dress for Anne. "Of course," she said. "I'll go tomorrow. I believe a nice rich brown would be lovely." "Well now, thank you," said Matthew. And I'd like the sleeves made in the new way." "Puffs? Of course," said Mrs. Lynde. Christmas morning broke on a beautiful snow-covered world. Anne looked out of her window with delighted eyes, then ran downstairs singing. "Merry Christmas, Marilla! Merry Christmas, Matthew! Isn't it a lovely Christmas? Why, Matthew, is that for me?" "Oh, Matthew!" Matthew had unfolded the dress from its paper and held it out to Anne. Marilla watched from the kitchen. Anne took the dress and looked at it in silence. Oh, how pretty it was! "That's a Christmas present for you, Anne," said Matthew shyly. Anne's eyes filled with tears. "Oh, Matthew! Oh, I can never thank you enough. Look at those pretty puff sleeves. This must be a happy dream." When breakfast was over, Diana arrived in a pretty red dress. "I've got something for you," she said. "Aunt Josephine sent us a big box of presents, and this is for you." Anne opened the box and looked in. Inside was a pair of the most precious, pretty little shoes. "You can wear them for the concert instead of your boots," said Diana. The concert that evening was a wonderful success. The little hall was crowded and all the performers did very well. When it was all over, Anne and Diana walked home together. Your poetry reading brought down the house, Anne. "Oh, I was so nervous, Diana, but I thought of my lovely puff sleeves and took courage." "Wasn't the boys' reading good?" said Diana. "Gilbert Blythe was excellent. Anne, do you know, when you ran off, one of your roses fell out of your hair? I saw Gil pick it up and put it in his pocket." "Humph!" said Anne. That night, Marilla and Matthew sat for a while by the kitchen fire. "Our Anne did as well as any of them," said Matthew proudly. "Yes, she did. And she looked really nice, too," said Marilla. "Anne's getting older. She'll need something more than Avonlea school soon." "Yes, I guess the best thing we can do for her will be to send her to Queen's," Matthew replied. "But we don't need to say anything for a year or two yet." Chapter 9. The Problem with Vanity. Marilla, walking home one late April evening, realized that the winter was over and gone. It did not matter how old she was. This thought still made her happy. She thought of the fire going and a table nicely spread for tea, and she felt happy that Anne was home to do these things. So when she entered a kitchen and found the fire dark with no sign of Anne, she was very disappointed and annoyed. "I'll tell Miss Anne what I think when she comes home," said Marilla, making the tea herself. "I don't care if Mrs. Allan does say she's the brightest and sweetest child she ever knew." It was dark when tea was ready, and still no sign of Anne. Marilla went to light the candle in Anne's room and saw the girl lying on the bed face down. "Please, Marilla, go away and don't look at me," said a small voice. "Anne Shirley, whatever is the matter with you? What have you done?" "Look at my hair, Marilla," she whispered. Marilla lifted her candle and looked at Anne's hair, which ran all down her back. It looked strange. "Anne Shirley, what have you done to your hair?" "Why, it's green." "Yes, it's green," groaned Anne. "I thought nothing could be as bad as red hair, but now I know it's 10 times worse to have green hair." "How did this happen?" "I dyed it. I knew it was a bad thing to do," said Anne. "But I didn't mean to dye it green, Marilla. He said it would turn my hair a beautiful black." "Who said? Who are you talking about?" "The man who came this afternoon. I bought the dye from him." "Anne Shirley, how often have I told you never to let one of those men in the house?" "Oh, I didn't let him inside. He had a big box full of very interesting things, and he told me he was working hard to make enough money to bring his wife and children out from Germany. But what am I going to do?" Anne's unhappiness continued for a week. During that time, she went nowhere and washed her hair every day. Nothing worked. At the end of the week, Marilla said, "It's no use, Anne. Your hair must be cut off. There is no other way. You can't go out with it looking like that." And so, Marilla cut almost all of Anne's hair off. Everybody talked about Anne in school on Monday, but to her relief, nobody guessed the real reason for her new haircut. Anne told Marilla all the things the girls had said about her and all the things the boys had said about her. Then she said, "But am I talking too much, Marilla? Does it hurt your head?" "My head is better now," said Marilla, "and I don't mind your talking. I've gotten so used to it." That was Marilla's way of saying that she liked to hear it. Chapter 10. An Unfortunate Lily Girl. "Of course, you must play Elaine, Anne," said Diana. "I'm not doing it," said Ruby Gillis, "to lie down in the boat and pretend I was dead. Oh, I just couldn't. I couldn't keep still," said Jane Andrews. As girls of 13 going on 14, the pond was their new favorite place to play. It was Anne's idea that they act out Elaine, the Lily Girl. They had studied Tennyson's poem in school over winter. Anne's plan was to set a boat off carrying the dead Elaine and let it float under the bridge to the other side of the pond where it would be caught by the others. "Well, I'll be Elaine," said Anne. "Ruby, you must be King Arthur. Jane will be Guinevere, and Diana must be Lancelot." Anne lay in the boat and held a flower to her chest. "Oh, she does look really dead," whispered Ruby Gillis nervously, watching the still, white little face. "Mrs. Lynde says that acting is very bad." "Ruby, you shouldn't talk about Mrs. Lynde," said Anne, "because this is hundreds of years before Mrs. Lynde was born." The boat began to float away. At first, Anne enjoyed the romance of being the Lily Girl. Then, something not at all romantic happened. The boat began to break. It looked like it would fill and sink, and Anne could not swim. Just then, the boat hit an old wooden pile. Anne jumped out of the boat and grabbed it. She held on and waited for the girls to find her. The boat went under the bridge and then sank. Ruby, Jane, and Diana watched it sink and were sure that Anne had gone down with it. They screamed and ran off to find help. Poor Anne was still hanging on to the wooden pile. The minutes passed by, each seeming like an hour to the unfortunate Lily Girl. Just then, Gilbert Blythe came under the bridge in a little boat. "Anne Shirley, how on earth did you get there?" he asked. Without waiting for an answer, he pulled close to the pile and held out his hand. Anne jumped into the boat, scared and angry. "We were playing Elaine," said Anne, trying not to look at him. Gilbert took Anne to land, where the girl jumped out. "Thank you," she said, and turned away. But Gilbert had also jumped from the boat. "Anne," he said, "I'm very sorry I called your hair carrots. I think your hair is very pretty now. Let's be friends." Anne thought for a moment. Then she remembered that she hated Gilbert Blythe. She would never forgive him. "No," she said coldly, "I shall never be friends with you, Gilbert Blythe." "All right." Gilbert jumped back into the boat, his face red. "I'll never ask you to be friends again, Anne Shirley." As Anne walked away, she regretted that she had not answered Gilbert differently. She wanted to cry. When she told her friends what had happened, they thought it was very romantic. "Will you ever have any sense, Anne?" groaned Marilla later. "Oh, yes, I think I will, Marilla," said Anne. "Ever since I came to Green Gables, I've been making mistakes, and each mistake has helped me. The cake mistake stopped me from being careless in cooking. Dyeing my hair stopped me from being vain. And today's mistake is going to cure me of being too romantic." "I hope so," said Marilla. But Matthew, who had been sitting in his corner, said, "Don't give up all your romance, Anne." Chapter 11. A Special Moment in Anne's Life. One fine evening, Anne was walking the cows home when Diana ran to meet her. "Oh, I have such news, Anne. Mother got a letter, and Aunt Josephine wants you and me to go to town to stay with her." Marilla agreed to let Anne go to town. As Charlottetown was 30 miles away, they needed to make a very early start. Anne was up before sunrise Tuesday morning. It was a long drive, but Anne and Diana enjoyed every minute of it. It was beautiful to ride through the country, and they were very excited to be going to the city. It was almost noon when they reached town. Miss Barry met them at the door. "So you've come to see me at last, Anne girl," she said. "How you have grown! You're taller than I am, and you're ever so much better looking than you used to be, too." Everyone said that Anne was becoming very pretty as she got older. "Isn't it just like a palace?" whispered Diana as they waited for lunch. "Yes, I've dreamed of such a house, Diana," said Anne. "It is so beautiful, there is nothing left to imagine. That is one good thing about being poor. There are so many more things you can dream about." At night, Miss Barry put Anne and Diana in the spare room, as she had promised. Yet Anne felt some disappointment. Things you wanted as a child aren't as great when you finally get them. On Friday, Mr. Barry came to drive them home. "Well, I hope you've enjoyed yourselves," said Miss Barry. "Yes, we have," said Diana. "And you, Anne girl?" "I've enjoyed every minute of it," said Anne. Then Miss Barry went back into her big, empty house. "I think if I had a child like Anne in the house all the time, I'd be a better and happier woman," she said to herself. When Anne arrived home, the lights of Green Gables gave her a friendly welcome back. Anne ran up the hill and into the kitchen, where a hot meal was waiting on the table. "I'm glad you're back," said Marilla with a smile. "It's been very lonely here without you." "I had a wonderful time," Anne said happily. "The best of all was coming home." "That is good to hear," said Marilla. "Anne, Miss Stacy was here this afternoon." "Was she? What did she want?" "Well, she wants to organize a class for her advanced students who are studying to enter Queen's. She wants to give them extra lessons for an hour after school. She came to ask Matthew and me if we would like to have you join in. What do you think, Anne? Would you like to go to Queen's and learn to become a teacher?" "Oh, Marilla, it's been the dream of my life, but isn't it terribly expensive?" "You shouldn't worry about the expense. Matthew and I decided long ago that we would do the best we could for you and give you a good education. You will always have a home here at Green Gables, but a girl should be able to earn her own living. So you can join the class if you like, Anne." "Oh, Marilla, thank you," said Anne happily. Chapter 12. A Queen's Girl. It was a long, hot summer that year, and Anne enjoyed it with her whole heart. When it was over, she went back to school and studied hard in Miss Stacy's Queen's class for that terrible thing known as the entrance. Anne grew so quickly that one day Marilla was surprised to find that the girl was taller than herself. Another difference was that she talked less. "You don't talk half as much as you used to, Anne. What has come over you?" "I don't know. I don't want to talk as much," Anne said, turning red. "It's nicer to think dear, pretty thoughts and keep them in one's heart, like treasures." After months of studying, Anne went to town for the exams. When she returned to Green Gables, 3 weeks passed without the exam results appearing. Anne did not know what to do with herself. Then, one evening, Anne was sitting at her open window when she saw Diana come running up the hill with a newspaper in her hand. "Anne, you've passed!" she cried. "And you came first! You and Gilbert both. You are tied." "Well now, I always said it," said Matthew, looking at the exam result list delightedly. "I knew you could beat them all easily." The next 3 weeks were a busy time at Green Gables. Anne was getting ready to go to Queen's, and there was much to be done. Anne was to have many new clothes. Matthew saw to that, and Marilla did not say anything. She even made Anne a beautiful green dress for special occasions. As Marilla watched Anne packing her things, she began to cry. "I wish you could have stayed a little girl, Anne. You've grown up now, and you're going away. It makes me feel so lonely." "Marilla," Anne sat down next to her. "I will always be your little Anne, who will love you and Matthew and dear Green Gables every day of her life." Marilla put her arms around her girl and held her close, wishing that she need never let her go. The day finally came for Anne to go to town. She and Matthew drove in one fine September morning. The next day, Anne and the rest of the Avonlea students went to Queen's Academy. "I wonder if I will make new friends," Anne thought. Of course, I promised Diana that no Queen's girl would ever be as dear to me as she is, but I can still make friends. Oh, it is so lonely here." It was lonelier still when Anne found herself alone in her little bedroom that night. It was a boarding house in town with a hard and cold street instead of trees outside. She wanted to cry. Anne decided to try hard to win the Avery Scholarship, given to the person with the highest grade in English and English literature. If she won the scholarship, she would be given money to attend Redmond College. Then, one day, she would become a real graduate. Imagine how proud Matthew would be then. Chapter 13. The Glory and the Dream. Anne's homesickness wore off, greatly helped by her weekend visits home. After the Christmas holidays, the Avonlea students gave up going home on Fridays and settled down to hard work. By this time, it was clear that the medal contestants were down to 3: Gilbert Blythe, Anne Shirley, and Lewis Wilson. The Avery Scholarship was more doubtful. Anne worked hard and steadily throughout the exams, but still she was nervous on the day the final results came out. Anne and Jane were walking down the street together. Anne was pale and quiet. In 10 more minutes she would know who had won the medal and who the Avery. "Of course you'll win one of them," said Jane. When they arrived at Queen's, they found the hall full of boys who were carrying Gilbert Blythe around on their shoulders and yelling, "Hurrah for Blythe, medalist!" For a moment, Anne felt a terrible pang of defeat and disappointment. So she had lost and Gilbert had won. And then somebody called out, "3 cheers for Miss Shirley, winner of the Avery!" Matthew and Marilla came to the award evening to see the tall girl in pale green, who everybody whispered about as the Avery winner. "So, are you happy we kept her, Marilla?" whispered Matthew. "Yes, yes," replied Marilla. Miss Barry, who was sitting behind them, leaned forward. "Aren't you proud of that Anne girl? I am," she said. Anne went home with Matthew and Marilla that evening. She had not been home since April. Diana was at Green Gables to meet her. "Oh, Diana, it's so good to see you." "You've done very well, Anne. I suppose you won't be teaching now that you've won the Avery?" "No, I'm going to Redmond College in September." "Did you hear that Gilbert Blythe will teach? He has to. His father can't afford to send him to college next year." Anne was surprised. She thought that Gilbert would be going to Redmond also. What would she do without him to make her work hard? The next morning at breakfast, Anne saw that Matthew was not looking well. "Marilla," she said when he had gone out, "is Matthew well?" "No, he isn't," said Marilla. "He's had a bad time with his heart. Maybe he will take a rest now that you're home." "You are looking tired too, Marilla. I'm going to take this one day off, and then it will be your turn to be lazy while I do the work." "It's not the work, it's my head," smiled Marilla. "But have you heard anything about the Abbey Bank lately, Anne?" "I heard it was shaky," answered Anne. "Why?" "Well, all we have saved is in that bank. Every penny. I am quite worried about it." Anne had a good day outdoors. She never forgot that day. It was so bright and golden. She visited all her favorite places. She had a talk with Mrs. Allen. And finally, in the evening, she went with Matthew for the cows. "If I had been the boy you sent for," said Anne, "I'd be able to help you so much now." "Well now, I'd rather have you than a dozen boys, Anne," said Matthew. "I'm so proud of you, my girl." He smiled his shy smile at her. Anne took the memory of it with her when she went to her room that night. Anne always remembered the peaceful beauty and calm of that night. It was the last night before sadness touched her life, and her life would never be quite the same again. Chapter 14. The Touch of Death. "Matthew! Matthew! What is the matter? Matthew, are you sick?" Anne heard Marilla's voice and dropped her flowers, running across the kitchen to Matthew. She was too late. He had fallen to the floor. "He's fainted," cried Marilla. Anne and Marilla were trying to revive him when Mr. and Mrs. Barry arrived with Mrs. Lynde. Mrs. Lynde examined Matthew. Then she sadly looked at the others, and the tears came to her eyes. "Oh, Marilla," she said seriously, "I don't think we can do anything for him." "Mrs. Lynde, you don't think Matthew is—" Anne could not say the word. "Child, yes. Look at his face. It is a look that I know well." When the doctor came, he said that death had been immediate and probably painless, caused by some sudden shock. The shock was found in the paper Matthew held, which told of the failure of the Abbey Bank. His entire life savings were lost because of the bank's failure. The news spread quickly through town, and all day friends and neighbors came to Green Gables. For the first time, shy, quiet Matthew Cuthbert was a person of importance. His death had set him apart. The night came and the house fell quiet. For a long time, Anne could not cry. Finally, she fell asleep but woke up in the middle of the night. She thought about what had happened that day, and the tears came. Marilla heard her in the other room and went to hold her. Anne and Marilla sat together and cried and cried. Nobody else could understand their sadness, even though they tried. "Oh, Marilla, what are we going to do?" cried Anne. "We've got each other," the old lady replied. "I don't know what I'd do if you weren't here. Oh, you must know that I love you just as much as Matthew did." 2 days afterward, Matthew Cuthbert was buried. It did not take long for life at Green Gables to return to normal, even though they all carried the pain of Matthew's death with them. Anne felt somehow that it was cruel to Matthew that she could still find the sunset beautiful and enjoy the flowers in the garden. "I miss him so much, all the time, and yet the world and life are still very beautiful and interesting to me," said Anne to Mrs. Allan one day. "Today, Diana said something funny, and I found myself laughing. I thought when it happened that I could never laugh again. When Matthew was here, he liked to hear you laugh, and he liked to see you happy. He still wants you to enjoy these things," said Mrs. Allan gently. Marilla was sitting on the front doorsteps when Anne arrived home. Anne sat down beside her. "Dr. Spencer says that I must go in and have my eyes examined tomorrow," said Marilla. "You won't mind staying, will you? There's ironing and baking to do." "I shall be all right. You don't need to worry that I'll flavor the cake with medicine or dye my hair." Marilla laughed. "Do you know who I saw in church last Sunday?" she asked. "Gilbert Blythe. He looks a lot like his father did at the same age. John Blythe was a nice boy. We used to be real good friends, he and I. People called him my boyfriend." Anne looked up. "What happened?" "We had an argument. I wouldn't forgive him when he asked me to. I always felt rather sorry. I've always wished I'd forgiven him when I had the chance." "So you've had a bit of romance in your life, too," said Anne softly. "Yes, I suppose you might call it that. You wouldn't think so to look at me, would you? I'd forgotten about John myself, but it all came back to me when I saw Gilbert last Sunday." Chapter 15. The Bend in the Road. Marilla went to town the next day and returned in the evening. "Anne, the specialist said that if I give up all reading and sewing, and if I'm careful not to cry, my eyes may not get any worse. But if I don't, he says I'll be blind in 6 months." Anne was silent. How things had changed since she arrived home. But she now knew what she needed to do. "Marilla, I have something to tell you. You won't have to stay here alone. I'll be with you. I'm not going to Redmond." "Not going to Redmond?" Marilla looked at Anne. "No, I'm not going to take the scholarship. I'm going to teach. I've applied for the school here, but I think it has been promised to Gilbert Blythe. But I can teach at another school. I have it all planned out, Marilla. You won't be lonely. We'll be happy here together, you and I." "Oh, Anne, I can't let you give up your dream for me. I'm not giving up my dream. Anne laughed. It has just changed a little, a bend in the road. My mind is quite made up, Marilla. I'm not going to Redmond, and I am going to stay here and teach. You wonderful girl, said Marilla. The news soon spread around town. Most people thought Anne was foolish not to go to Redmond, but Mrs. Allan and Mrs. Lynde did not. Well, Anne, I hear they're going to let you teach in the school right here in Avonlea, said Mrs. Lynde the next day. Mrs. Lynde, cried Anne, surprised. I thought they had promised it to Gilbert Blythe. So they did. As soon as Gilbert heard that you had applied for it, he went to them and made them give it to you. He is going to teach at White Sands. It was real kind and thoughtful of him, I think. Anne went to the little Avonlea graveyard the next evening to put fresh flowers on Matthew's grave. When she was walking back, she saw a tall young man whistling. It was Gilbert, and the whistle died on his lips as he recognized Anne. Anne stopped and held out her hand. Gilbert, she said, I want to thank you for giving up the school for me. It was very good of you. Gilbert took her hand. I was pleased to be able to help you. Are we going to be friends after this? Have you really forgiven me? Anne laughed. I forgave you that day by the pond, although I didn't know it. I've been sorry ever since. We were born to be good friends, Anne, said Gilbert happily. I know we can help each other in many ways. Come, I'm going to walk home with you. Who walked home with you, Anne? Asked Marilla later. Gilbert Blythe, answered Anne. What did you have to talk to him about for half an hour? Asked Marilla with a smile. Were we really there half an hour? Well, we have a lot to talk about, Marilla. That night, Anne sat at her window for a long time. She could hear the gentle sound of the wind flowing through the trees, and she felt quite happy. She was excited about what the future would bring. God's in his heaven, all's right with the world, whispered Anne softly. Playlet, Anne of Green Gables. This is an untold story from Anne of Green Gables. Josie, Prissy, and Tilly are Anne's classmates. The children are in class working. Anne is seated across from Gilbert Blythe. Excuse me, Mr. Phillips. Could you please help me with this math problem?
Certainly, Prissy.
The students begin doing whatever they feel like, eating, drawing pictures, and talking to each other, while Mr. Phillips is busy. Here, Anne, you can have this apple. Thanks, Ruby. I am so happy that I decided to come to this school. Everybody is so nice. Yeah, but the teacher always helps Prissy out first. It's not fair. That's because she's studying for the entrance exam to Queen's Academy next year. Well, the other day I saw him writing something on her slate, and when Prissy read it, she turned red and giggled. It didn't have anything to do with the lesson. I hope I'll be just as beautiful as Prissy when I'm 16. Anne, Minnie McPherson just told me that she heard Prissy Andrews tell Sarah Gillis that you have a very pretty nose. Oh, yes, that is nice. Thank you. Look at Gilbert Blythe, Anne. He is so handsome. Yes, but doesn't he look like Julia Bell? No, I don't think so. He said she has too many freckles. Don't talk to me about freckles. I've got so many. No boy will ever like me. That's not true. Charlie Sloane told his mother that you were the smartest girl in school. That's better than being pretty. Is it? It is nice to be at top of the class, but I think I'd rather be pretty. Anyway, Charlie Sloane isn't handsome at all. Ugh! Do you know what I heard? Next week, we're all going to learn a new ball game. Really? I heard we're going to learn a new song. No, I heard Alice Andrews is going to bring a new book next week, and we're all going to read it out loud. No, I heard we're going to learn a dance. I would love to dance with Gilbert Blythe. Well, I love to read out loud. I hope we do that. I hope we learn a new song. I love to sing. Anne becomes interested in something she sees out of the window. Gilbert Blythe tries to make Anne look at him. Anne does not see him. Gilbert picks up the end of Anne's long red braid.
Look, everyone, carrots. Anne has carrots on her head.
Carrots, carrots! You mean, hateful boy! How dare you!
Ow!
Ooh! Oh, no!
Anne Shirley, what does this mean?
I can't tell you what he said.
It was my fault, Mr. Phillips. I teased her. I'm sorry to see a student of mine with such a bad temper. Anne, go and stand in front of the blackboard for the rest of the afternoon.
Anne goes and stands by the blackboard. Mr. Phillips writes above her head, Anne Shirley has a very bad temper. Anne Shirley must learn to control her temper.
Now, Anne, read aloud what I have written.
Anne Shirley has a very bad temper. Anne Shirley must learn to control her temper. But it isn't true, sir. The bell rings for the end of school. Anne walks out of the classroom. Gilbert Blythe follows her.
Please, Anne, I'm really sorry I made fun of your hair. Don't be mad forever now.
Gilbert, I hate you! Never talk to me again! Anne, are you okay? No! I will never forgive Gilbert Blythe, and Mr. Phillips spelled my name without an E! It has been a terrible, terrible day. You mustn't let Gilbert upset you. He makes fun of all the girls. He laughs at my hair because it's so black. He's called me a crow a dozen times, and I never heard him apologize for anything before either. There's a big difference between being called a crow and being called carrots. Gilbert Blythe has really hurt my feelings, Diana. Come on, let's go home.